Mark, I didn't bring your book. You want me to go downstairs and get your book too?
That's all right. All right. We are now going live. Better late than never. We just got started here. Welcome, everybody, to the latest installment of Rev War Revelry with Emerging Revolutionary War. I'm Mark Malloy, and we're here tonight, actually in the middle of the anniversary of the 10 Crucial Days campaign. And we got kind of a hive mind of some of the best experts on the 10 Crucial Days that occurred from December 25th, 1776 to January 3rd, 1777. Yeah, we're just going to be talking about the battles, their significance. We'll discuss some of the myths and misconceptions. And of course, we'll also talk about the battlefields today, what you can see there today, and some of the significant sites as well. But we'll go ahead and get started with some introductions. So why don't we start off with Larry Kidder, and just introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about yourself and some of your research. We got a couple authors here that have written a lot about this area and this time period. So let's start off with Larry. Introduce yourself and some of the work you've done on this time period.
Okay. Well, I'm Larry Kidder, and I'm a retired history teacher. And I've done a lot of work over the years developing history courses and trying to teach courses in such a way that the students think of history as something to do, not just something to memorize, and to have students do a little research and understand how we get to know the past, as well as just reading what somebody thinks about the past. I've been doing a lot of work with living history at the Howell Living History Farm in Hopewell Township for over the last 30 years or so. And that's really what got me involved in researching the Revolution. Started researching agriculture in central New Jersey for the farm, and did a couple of books on that. But then because of a program for the farm where they wanted to do the Revolutionary War, I had to find out what was going on there during the Revolution. And that led to my study of the Hunterdon County Militia. And so what started out as research for a weekend program at the farm wound up a book. And that book led to 3 others, and working on a 4th now. So being retired gives me the time to do that. And it's just been a lot of fun. So I'm going to keep at it for a while.
Very good. That's great. Yeah, no, and the book he wrote about the 10 Crucial Days campaign is excellent. It just recently came out the other year. So if you get a chance, definitely look that up. But David, why don't you introduce yourself to the audience, and you have a connection to the site we're watching across the Delaware, and our author as well. So if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself.
Sure. That's right, Mark. And thank you, by the way, for inviting me to participate in this. So, well, I've described myself in the past as a history buff who likes to write, and I'm not going to deviate from that now. So it's too late to claim to be anything else. So I went up to Washington Crossing Historic Park on a cold February day in February 2014, about 6 months after I had retired from my job with the state, and learned that they were looking for tour guides. Well, they call them historical interpreters. I haven't quite figured out what the difference is between the two other than the spelling. But so a few months later, I was certified, I think is the term they use, to give tours there. And so I started doing that. I was volunteering for the better part of 2 years, and then they unvolunteered me, and I became a part-time member of their interpretive staff, giving tours at the Pennsylvania version of the 2 sister parks, Washington Crossing Historic Park, as opposed to Washington Crossing State Park on the New Jersey side. And so I've been giving tours there for the last 6 or 7 years, which focus on the 10 crucial days generally, but as you can imagine, we expend most of our firepower on the crossing, the Christmas night crossing, and the first Battle of Trenton. And so I've been doing that. I also started giving tours a couple years ago under the auspices of the Princeton Battlefield Society, which of course Larry and Roger have both been heavily involved in. So I've been doing that as well. And so the 3 books that I've written are really an outgrowth of what I've been doing at Washington Crossing Historic Park. It's my, yeah, Roger's holding up the first book in the trilogy. I had started writing book reviews for the monthly electronic newsletter of the Friends of Washington Crossing Park. And I did that for a while, and then I decided, well, I want to write something else. So I thought, well, maybe I'll write about some quote unquote unsung patriot heroes. And I wrote a couple of profiles for the newsletter about them. And then somebody there suggested that I try writing a book. And of course, my initial reaction was that this individual had lost her mind. But I thought, well, I'll give it a shot. So that gave rise to Rescuing the Revolution. And along the way, I ran into Roger. Not literally, but I knew he was a literary agent and a Rev War nut, and I'd seen him hanging around the park. And I thought, this was after I had shown the manuscript to everybody else there. I thought, well, why not show it to him? He is a literary agent, and he knows something about the period. And then I found out that he was about to start mucking around in the publishing world, and so one thing led to another, and that became a very short book. And then that led to the second book, The Road to Assunpink Creek. And I guess I don't know if you want me to talk about this now, maybe I can look later. My Assunpink Creek centric view of the 10 crucial days really had its genesis when I was working for the state in Trenton in a building that's a long stone's throw from the creek. And I had the opportunity to wander down there on my lunch hour after reading David Hackett Fisher's book, and that got me to thinking about, what went on there. And then I guess around midway through that second book, I decided, well, wouldn't it be neat to try to write a trilogy about the TCD, 10 Crucial Days? And so that led to the third book, John Hazlitt's World. John Hazlitt, of course, was one of the people I profiled in the first book. And I decided to see if I could craft, a literary effort of book length about someone for whom we really know very little in terms of his pre-Rev War life. So that came out recently. And the other thing, unlike Larry, I am not writing a book now. I'm just I don't even know that I'm thinking about it. I'm thinking about it. And don't ask me what that means. But I am working on a series of blog posts on topics relating to the Revolutionary War on my website. If I can inject a shamelessly self-promotional note, DP Author, that's DP as in David Price, dpauthor.com. And the blog is titled Speaking of Which. And, well, that's about it.
Very good. And Roger.
Well, so I wear a lot of hats. I was actually a historical interpreter at Washington Crossing Historic Park before David. And then I became, I was on the board of the Princeton Battlefield Society. And another fellow who both Larry and David know, and I launched an organization called 10crucialdays.org. 10crucialdays.org is really sort of an umbrella marketing organization for the 4 sites and venues of the 10 Crucial Days. Washington Crossing Historic Park, Pennsylvania, Washington Crossing State Park, New Jersey, the Old Barracks Museum in Trenton, and the Princeton Battlefield Society. Larry Kidder and I actually do host a series of tours that are run through Washington Crossing Historic Park as historical interpreters. As David mentioned, I am a literary agent, but because of David, I am also a publisher. As he mentioned, when he mentioned that he was going to write a book, it was just about the same time that I said, well, I'm actually starting an imprint. So both David and Larry have been very patient with me as I've learned how to go from being just a literary agent and a sales and marketing guy to a publisher. And I have since published 3 of David's books and 3 of Larry's books and many other books through my imprint, knoxpress.com. And of any of you, you know, we're all Rev War buffs here. Knox Press obviously comes from Henry Knox. So, but on top of that, I'm president of the New Jersey, of the Princeton chapter of the New Jersey Society, the Sons of the American Revolution. I'm also a member of the Delaware and the Vermont societies. I'm a member of the education and the 250 committees for the SAR. I'm a member of the Sons of the Revolution, which is a different organization. I'm executive producer of a musical called The Crossing in the 10 Crucial Days, of which Larry is also the historical advisor for that musical. And like David and Larry, I'm also a member of a number of other historic organizations, including the Congress of American Revolutionary War Roundtable. So it's a regular communication of all of the roundtables that are up and down the East Coast. So, you know, as David mentioned earlier, we're all a bunch of Rev War geeks involved one way or the other. So there you go. Long introductions for all of us.
Yeah. Well, that's great. I mean, like I said, I think it's good to, you know, you guys obviously have a lot of history, a lot of information that you garnered over the years being at these sites where this stuff happened.
Yeah.
And like I said, I think it's great having other authors who have written about these time periods that were, you know, obviously, and I think the name 10 Crucial Days is an apt description of the campaign because of its significance and importance in the founding of the country.
Mark, if I could, 10 Crucial Days is a term that we sort of use collectively for actually 2 campaigns. The United States Army recognizes the Trenton campaign and the Princeton campaign. It's actually 2, they actually refer to them as 2 separate campaigns. We look at them as one campaign. They are all intertwined. I mean, there were 10 crucial days where you had 2, you know, these 2 campaigns were really sort of merged together. And that's what we're going to be looking at. We're going to be sort of looking at how without one, the other couldn't have really succeeded. So.
No, I think that's a very good description because there is a break in between the two separate actions, so to speak, when Washington goes back on the other side of the Delaware. But let's for our audience, let's talk first about the actual crossing of the Delaware. As you can see, I got the image up behind me. I feel like most people think of this, you know, when they hear about, you know, they know anything about the 10 Crucial Days, the one thing they're probably familiar with is the crossing of the Delaware. And it's mostly because of the painting, I think. I guess, you know, can we get a little, I don't know, maybe Larry or David, if one of you guys want to talk a little bit about, you know, what happened there and, you know, is this painting, you know, accurate of what occurred that night? I feel like that's what most people like to talk about.
You could spend a half hour just talking about the painting. I read somewhere that one of the three most celebrated works of art in the Western world, the other two being by Da Vinci, The Last Supper and the Mona Lisa. And, you know, what I've told people is, I don't know whether Leutze didn't know the details or did, but, you know, figured he wasn't going to sweat the small stuff. What makes it a great painting, I think, is, and why it resonates with the public and has, you know, for generations, even more so than other paintings that are more technically accurate, is because Leutze did such a brilliant job of conveying the mood music. I think you see it in the facial expressions of the soldiers and their physical postures. You really get a sense of what they must have been feeling at the time. Their courage, their determination, their desperation, and and the other thing that really resonates with me is, you know, notwithstanding all the technical defects, which, you know, we can get into if you want, but is the symbolism, or some aspects of the symbolism. For example, I particularly like the fact that he has the black gentleman in the boat next to Washington's immediate left, who presumably is a Marblehead or one of the, you know, one of the soldiers, one of the seafaring soldiers, if you will, from the North Shore. And it was part of the message, I think, that Leutze was trying to send. Remember, when this painting came to the United States, it was in 1851, I believe. This was actually the second version of the painting. The first one was partially damaged and stayed behind at his studio in Dusseldorf, Germany. But this, of course, was about a decade before the Civil War broke out. And so it was at a time when slavery had become the dominant political issue, or the dominant issue of the national political agenda. And Leutze was an ardent abolitionist. And so I think this was his way of sending a message that the American Revolution was for everyone, not just for white people. And of course, more generally, I believe that he painted this, you know, in the wake of the democratic revolutions that had broken out throughout Western Europe in the 1840s. And so this was his way of trying to, you know, hold up the American Revolution as imperfect as it was from the standpoint of achieving widespread democracy, here as a template for, you know, freedom-loving people around the globe.
No,
Yeah.
When I give tours, I always say to people, this piece of work is the second most iconic piece of art of American military history. And invariably everybody else will come up with what the first is, which are iconic image in American military history, and the first being the Iwo Jima, the photograph of Iwo Jima. And it's a great piece of propaganda art. I mean, essentially what Leutze was doing here is he was sending a message to his fellow countrymen who were from these disparate states in Germany. He was trying to convince them that they should all join Prussia and become one Germany, which is kind of ironic because the Americans were going to attack the Hessians. But essentially, that's what this is. It's a propaganda painting for his fellow countrymen, saying if the Americans can do it, we can do it too. So, but the whole first chapter of Hackett Fischer's book sort of goes into the painting in detail. It's fascinating.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right as far as it being up there. Yeah, right next to Iwo Jima. And you know, David was just mentioning African Americans, you know, taking part in this campaign. Larry, I think you're actually doing some research on African Americans who fought at the Battle of Trenton. Would you care to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Before I do that, I'd just like to comment on the painting and how it is not really a good representation of the crossing itself, because it omits something very important. And Roger has put behind him a more recent painting that kind of makes up for that. One of the things that we need to remember about this crossing is he not only crossed men, but he crossed artillery. And he crossed a great deal of artillery, much more than one would expect from the number of men that he was using in this campaign. And that artillery is going to play a very important role because of the weather of the battle that takes place. Artillery was known as the foul weather weapon. And when muskets would get messed up by the moisture and the gunpowder and all of that, artillery worked better. It's also going to slow him down a great deal to get it all across. He's going to have to cross horses. He's going to have to cross wagons with ammunition, all kinds of stuff. What I don't like about the paintings behind Roger right now is the artillery piece is not connected to horses. They would not have loaded it on that ferry boat and then disconnected the horses and then across the river connected the horses back up again. They would have just all gone as a unit. But the painting behind Roger also points out something key to the crossing. Why was it done at a ferry? Why wasn't it done somewhere else on the river? For the boats that you see in the Leutze painting, those could have crossed anywhere on the river. They didn't need a ferry landing. They didn't need a rope across to guide the ferry. They didn't need to use ferry boats, the flat barge-like ferry boats. And that's the reason he chose McConkey's Ferry. One of the reasons he chose is because it was a ferry and there were ferry boats available. And so the Durham boats were not even meant to go across the river. They were meant to go up and down the river and carry heavy loads, not people. Whereas the ferry boats were designed to carry horses, wagons, people, etc. So I think that to really understand the nature of the crossing, aside from the reasons for it and all that, but just how it was done, how it was accomplished on that stormy night in the icy water, it's important to recognize the two different styles of boats and the need to be doing this at a ferry crossing.
No, I think that's really good information to know. We did get a question, since we have an author about Hazlitt. Did Hazlitt fall overboard during the crossing?
Not that crossing. The return trip.
Yeah, that's what Bill Welch comment. He said he believed fell overboard on the way back to Pennsylvania. So.
If I could just interject a related note, the question that I don't know that we'll ever get a definitive answer to is regarding Hazlitt's crossing on the Christmas night, where some sources suggest that he and his men, the Delaware Regiment, what was left of the Delaware Regiment at the time, crossed at the end, went over at 3 o'clock in the morning when the last, remnants of the army got over to New Jersey. And but then there are conflicting accounts about that. Hazlitt, in the last letter, what was probably the last letter he ever wrote, said at Christmas, or I think something like on Christmas night, we recrossed the river at 3 a.m. But he doesn't specify whether he was referring to the whole army or to his own unit. I like to think that that he was talking about his own unit, that his men were part of the army's, acting as part of the army's protective rear guard in that instance, because they did that on any number of occasions prior to that.
Interesting. I'm glad Larry also brought up the importance of artillery, because I do think artillery plays a central role in the victory at the actual battle. So I think with the painting, for all its inaccuracies and everything, and Roger mentioned Fisher's book has a whole chapter about it. I think for all its inaccuracies, I think it does sum up a lot of the ideals of the cause and everything. But in order for this campaign to be successful, they would actually have to seek a victory at Trenton. So in the actual combat at Trenton, could you talk, Larry, I guess, a little bit about the artillery that at there when the combat broke open at 8 a.m. on December 26th?
Yeah. Well, Washington crossed 18 artillery pieces. And you know that on the march to Trenton, he divided the army into two divisions, one under General Greene and one under General Sullivan. And he put 9 artillery pieces with each division. And each division was divided into, I believe, 3 brigades. And each brigade had a couple of artillery pieces. It varied a little bit from one to another. I know Sergeant's brigade, which went with Sullivan, had 3 artillery pieces with it. I mentioned that because you mentioned my interest in Jacob Francis, the free black American who was in the battle. He was in Sergeant's brigade and came over. And again, those guys were late getting over too. Sergeant's brigade didn't get over till after midnight to the New Jersey side, and then marched down. When they got to Trenton, the artillery is going to be extremely important, both with Greene's division and with Sullivan's division. Once Greene's division had worked through the Hessian outposts on the outskirts of town and forced them back into town, he's going to set up artillery at the head of 2 streets that come together, Queen Street and King Street. And the Hessians are going to be forming up in those streets. One thing that's kind of a myth about Trenton is that the Hessians were all living at the old barracks. They actually were none of them living at the old barracks. They were living in houses and buildings spread throughout town. So when the attack came, they had to, get out of their multitude of buildings and form up in the streets and try to figure out what to do. And while they're doing that, the artillery is sending cannonballs down, almost like a bowling alley down these streets at the Hessians. The Hessians only had 6 pieces of artillery against the 18 of Washington. And several of those are going to get formed up in the streets to shoot back at Washington's artillery. And one of the first things that they're going to do is disable the Hessian artillery and eventually go down and capture them. So, like you say, Mark, the artillery was extremely important. It was also important in the Sullivan's division, which came in right about where the barracks is in the southern part of Trenton, and then went across and crossed over the Assunpink Creek to the Mill Hill area, and were firing artillery back at the Kniefhausen Regiment, which was the last regiment to surrender. And that Hessian regiment was unfortunate in its cannon. It had one that didn't work, and it got one that got stuck in the mud and couldn't be used. So the American artillery were really taking advantage in both of the endpoint attacks on Trenton and bringing the Hessians to surrender. So yeah, I think that's very quick, but I think that shows that the importance of the artillery.
And you mentioned the free black man fighting in there. What I guess how many free blacks or African Americans in general do we know were there? And I guess how are you finding your research about this particular free black man who you're researching right now, Sergeant?
Yeah, it's really a fabulous question, and one that I wish I could answer in more detail. Keep in mind that one of the problems in this time period of the war, this is early in the war. Okay, there's going to be 6.5 years after the Battle of Princeton, that the war is going to go on, and the number of blacks and the organization of the regiments and that sort of thing is going to be different then than it was at the time of the battles of Trenton and Princeton. Jacob Francis, the young man that I mentioned, was actually born in New Jersey, but he was fighting in a Massachusetts regiment. He'd been indentured out by his free black mother at a young age, and he got his indentured freedom at age 21, which turned out to be in January of 1775. He was owned, his time as an indentured servant was owned by a number of men And the last man to own him lived in Salem, Massachusetts. And that's how he got to Massachusetts. He lived there for 6 years while the revolution was really building up in the Boston area. And when he got his freedom and was figuring out what he's going to do with the rest of his life, he got involved with some British incursions into Salem and was very interested in all the things that were happening. And he wanted to enlist in the Continental Army. Well, he enlisted on the 31st of October of 1775. So at the Battle of Trenton, he's been in the Army for about 14 months. It's important to note that on the day that he enlisted is the very day that Washington, in his general orders to his troops, told his officers, don't enlist any blacks, free or slave. We don't want them. But somehow he got in anyway. Sergeant's regiment, accepted him. By the end of December, 2 months later, Washington had changed his mind and decided that it was okay for blacks to be in the Army, but he really only wanted ones that were already in. He didn't want to keep recruiting new ones. I mention that because it's so hard to tell how many blacks were at the Battle of Trenton. Most of the blacks were in New England regiments. New England was a lot more close to abolition than the middle colonies or the southern colonies. New Jersey, by the way, is going to be very late on abolition and was really not for it during the time of the Revolution at all. But Jacob, is in that regiment. I know that there's at least a couple of other men who were free blacks in that regiment. There certainly were in Connecticut regiments, Rhode Island regiments, New Hampshire regiments, but the exact number is really hard to tell. One regiment that we know had a significant number of blacks as well as Native Americans was the Marbleheaders, Glover's regiment, that did so much with the crossing. We were talking about the guys rowing the boats, and things like that. They were a significant regiment in terms of being recognized for the number of blacks that were there, as was Rhode Island. But Massachusetts was in there as well as Connecticut. So yes, there were definitely blacks who served at the Battle of Trenton. How many? That's a great question.
And more research to be done for sure.
Yeah.
Well, that's great. I want to bring Roger in to talk a little bit about, so if people go visit Trenton today, what can they see to learn about the actual battle that happened there on the 26th?
Well, the Old Barracks Museum does a great job with not only their programming, but they also have terrific staff of historical interpreters. They have some dioramas. They've got a little film. But as Larry mentioned, of course, the barracks itself actually was of really tertiary importance to the battle itself. I mean, the battle occurred in what are today just urban streets, and it's a shame. There are very few signs that are left. There is, of course, the Trenton Battle Monument, which is at the head of what is today Warren and Broad Streets in Trenton, and it's it's not necessarily a great section of Trenton, but it's certainly worth visiting. Anytime we give our tours and we bring artillerymen up onto the head of what was then King and Queen Street, the view that you get from where the artillery was placed, these artillerists say, "Wow, what a great field of fire." This is the Trenton Battle Monument. This is me yesterday with all my SAR guys doing we did a wreath laying up there, but when you look at the tour, when you do the tour in Trenton, you really have to be able to paint the picture of what it looked like in 1776. In one of Larry's books, The Crossroads of the Revolution, which was really the biography of Trenton, he's got some great maps in there in terms of explaining what the city looks like. And in David's books, The Road to Assunpink Creek, he also pulls together really what the landscape of what Trenton looked like in the 18th century. So you really have to envision how this whole area was farmland leading into these two almost parallel streets that went down to the river. But it's, this is the trouble with many Revolutionary War battlefields, from Lexington and Concord all the way, through the north. In the South, it's a little bit different. South, they have a little bit more open ground. But in the north, for example, with the New York campaign, there's nothing left. I mean, much of the battle in the New York campaign happened in some of the cemeteries, or in what is today Prospect Park, or in the middle of Brooklyn. It's the same thing here in Trenton. There's very little left. There's a few, but that's why the Old Barracks Museum does such a good job, because once you enter the grounds of the Old Barracks Museum, which is right in the middle of the city, you can sort of get that sense of the 18th century, what 18th century life was like, and the interpreters do well.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely true. And yeah, how many battlefields are now, part of urban landscapes. But it's still, I always think it's amazing to be on the actual ground where it happened. And we got a couple questions in the chat about James Monroe and his participation in this battle. And of course, he's depicted here in the Washington painting, crossing in the same boat as Washington, which didn't happen. But Washington, or Monroe, was engaged in the battle and was wounded. And the site where, right there on what was then King Street, being wounded in the street there, of course, today isn't marked in any way as far as a wayside or a marker saying, here, future president almost died. But, to still be in that same location is a pretty special thing. And I think it's great that, Roger, your group is out there. And Billy Griffith, one of our historians of the American Revolutionary War, posted a video yesterday. So it's nice to see you guys had a wreath there to remember the battle that happened there yesterday. And you mentioned the Old Barracks. I think they do a great job out. I said one of the things I really enjoy is the annual reenactment they do of the actual battle on the actual ground, which is pretty cool that they help. And I was talking to Larry before we started about how he helped. He helps narrate for the past couple of years that reenactment. Of course, this year, because of COVID, it was canceled. But hopefully next year we'll have the reenactors back out there to recreate the actual battles on the ground there in Trenton. And we even have somebody watching from Germany, and some people have some questions about Rahl and his decision-making process as far as allowing his men to be taken surprise. Were there any attempts to fortify Trenton, and should he have done something different that would have potentially saved his command from being totally overrun? And the age-old myth, were these guys hopelessly drunk after celebrating Christmas Day?
Mark, you raised a question that I had that I would like to, and I referenced it before we went on the air, that I'd really love to get everybody's opinion on. And that relates to why Rahl did not. multiple schools of thought, I think, as to why he did not fortify Trenton, although he had been ordered to do so by his superior, Colonel Carl von Donop, who was headquartered in Bordentown. And I gather there was no love lost between these two. But regardless of that, there's, the one school of thought that that Rawle chose not to do that because of the layout of the town, and he just figured it wasn't practical because of how open the town was. There was no way, just wasn't feasible to fortify the town in any serious or systematic way. And then another factor, of course, may have been given his comments attributed to him, perhaps at that time justifiably contemptuous attitude towards the Americans, and a feeling that Washington's army, based on the intel that the British spies were providing, was in no position to launch any kind of serious offensive operation. But there's this other school of thought, and I've never seen anything that documents this, and I'm very skeptical about it, but I'd like to know what you guys think, that the reason Rawle did not opt to fortify the town was that he didn't expect to be there that long, because he had been supposedly authorized by General William Howe, the British commander, up in New York, to, as soon as the ice on the river froze over, to take his brigade, his 3 regiments, 1,500 men across the river, and march down to Philadelphia and capture the American capital. Now, I'm skeptical about that for 3 reasons. One is that my understanding is that European armies normally didn't do that sort of thing during the winter months. But even more importantly, that I find it hard to believe that General Howe would have, well, first of all, that he would have said to Rawle, okay, fine, you can just take 1,500 men and go capture the American capital, which is, what he had, 3 regiments. But I also, perhaps even more importantly than that, I find it difficult to believe that Howe would have given a Hessian regiment the honor of capturing the rebel capital rather than a British unit. And then, of course, on a more practical level, I think it would have been a challenge for the Hessians by themselves if they were to march down to Philadelphia and try to take the capital, if they were being, occupying the city led by a commander who I don't think understood a word of English. But I'd like to know what you guys think of that notion that Rawle was just waiting to cross the river and occupy Philadelphia, and that was why he chose not to fortify Trenton.
Well, Barry, you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I don't know if that was a belief that he had or a hope that he had. The Hessians were not happy in Trenton. The Hessians had been led to believe when they first were assigned there earlier in December that it would be temporary, that the whole army, not just them, but the whole army would go on and take Philadelphia. And Howe originally, when he was chasing Washington across New Jersey, his idea was to get all the way to Philadelphia. He didn't plan to stop and just occupy New Jersey. I think in terms of why Rawle didn't put up any defenses, that's part of it. But I think it goes a lot more complex than that too. You mentioned that he had orders from von Donop to put a couple of redoubts, one in the north and one in the south part of Trenton. And he just basically blew that off, didn't do it. Even when von Donop sent an engineer to scout things out and plot things out with him, he just never followed up on it. You mentioned that he didn't get along with von Donop. Very true. He might have just disregarded the order out of, his antagonism for von Donop, which also included that he wanted more troops from von Donop. He wanted to be the boss. He didn't want to be subservient to von Donop. And he kept asking not only von Donop, but General Grant of the British Army, who was his superior, to redivide the troops, break the troops up differently so that Rawle had more of them. And that wasn't happening. So he was in a bad mood there too. Rahl also had a very low opinion of the American troops at this point. You know, Rahl was in Trenton because he had done so well at places like White Plains and Fort Washington and all of that. He was in a position of honor in the line of cantonments that the British had set up. And he was pretty sure of himself. At least one of Rahl's troopers, one of his Hessians, in his diary, basically said, and these are my words, not his, but the idea, he'd follow Rahl anywhere on the battlefield. He thought of him as a great commander on the battlefield, but he said, don't have him plan it. Don't have him be the guy that determines where the battle's going to be, how it's going to be fought. But once it gets started, you know, he'll carry it through and do a very good job. And I want to be with him when he does that. But they didn't have much respect for Rahl as a tactician or anything like that. So I think that was in it. I think also, you know, the myth that the Hessians were drunk and therefore they were surprised. They were not really surprised. I think that is a big myth, that the Hessians were surprised at Trenton. The Hessians were very, very alert the whole time they were at Trenton, because the Americans kept sending harassing parties across the Delaware virtually every day for the 2.5 weeks before the Battle of Trenton. We're talking 30, 40, 50 men at a time, you know, hit and run and then get back over to Pennsylvania. And also some New Jersey militia on the New Jersey side in the Hunterdon County area who would make attacks, harassing attacks on Hessian outposts, Hessian foraging parties, Hessian messengers, things like that. So Rahl had it in his head that Washington could only do harassing attacks. You know, the condition of his army and everything else, he was in for a long winter of harassing attacks. So he had to have his men on guard. His men every third day had to sleep in their uniforms, all belted up and, you know, ready to turn out. And they were on duty every third day in order to be ready for harassing attacks. I think that, you know, the Hessians were ready, but even the von Wiederholt, the Hessian lieutenant who was in charge of the outpost that General Greene ran into, his initial reaction in seeing the troops come out of the bad weather was, this is another harassing attack. But then all of a sudden there were hundreds of them instead of a dozen of them, you know, and then he realized that they were in trouble.
I think it's also worth pointing out that we talked earlier about the massive amount of firepower in terms of artillery that the Americans had with them. And that happened for a couple of reasons. First of all, Knox had convinced Washington that it was a hell of an idea because it would cause this shock and awe that would overpower the Hessians. At the time he was convincing Washington, they didn't know the weather was going to be as bad as it was. So that part of it was just pure dumb luck. But in terms of the surprise, it also turned out to be pure dumb luck that they had all of that firepower, because the weather was so bloody awful that night that it was going to be a lot harder to get the firearms, the muskets and the flintlocks and, you know, all the weapons to work. But the cannon were going to be more effective in weather like that. But the point here is that in terms of the surprise itself, the weather was so bad that it was just madness to think that anyone would launch an attack when in the middle of a nor'easter. In the 18th century, when your muskets had to have a dry powder, why would you launch an attack during that period of time? So that was the other part of the surprise aspect of it.
But it's also important to note that that night, every guard post was manned. All patrols had been sent out on a normal routine.
Right.
Some of them didn't go quite as far as they might have in better weather, but the Hessians were doing everything that they normally would do that night as preparing for some kind of an attack. They also, one of the reasons for the surprise was that about 50 Virginians had crossed over the river, not knowing Washington was going to cross later in the day. And they did a harassing attack on Trenton about 7 o'clock that night while Washington was crossing further up the river. And, were repulsed as a harassing attack. And so the Hessians basically were in a position of saying, well, we've had our attack. Now the weather is really getting bad. As Roger said, they aren't going to do anything else. And then when I mentioned that in the morning when Wiederholt saw the guys coming out of the weather, that was early enough in the morning. They were used to getting harassing attacks first thing in the morning. So that's another reason why they would look at this as just another harassing attack. But, I think that the Hessians need to have more credit for being on the ball and being good troops and that kind of thing, and not just a bunch of partiers that got interrupted.
I think, they quickly made easy scapegoats, I think, for a lot of people's agendas to quickly throw them under the bus in order to explain away this reversal of fortunes for the Crown forces. But we're getting late into the hour, so I don't know if we're going to be able to capture all of it. Now, I know David, one of his books is about the Second Battle of Trenton. We've only gotten through the first day of the 10 crucial days. Obviously, you could spend hours and hours talking about all these different topics. But David, if you could just talk very briefly just about, the Second Battle of Trenton. Washington, after the first battle, he captures these 900 Hessians, comes back over to Pennsylvania. He moves back over to New Jersey and settles down just south of the Assunpink Creek. And the British, under General Charles Cornwallis, are going to come down and make an attempt to try and crush Washington's force there. And I think in your book, you argue that this really was the crucial moment for the American Army and the cause of the American independence. Could you speak just a little briefly about the Second Battle of Trenton, the Battle of Assunpink Creek?
Yeah, I don't necessarily expect anyone to give great weight to my words, but I think it's worthwhile noting that Nathaniel Philbrick, in the middle of his middle volumes, Rev War trilogy, calls this the most unappreciated moment of the American Revolution. And I guess the thesis of my book was that the events of that day, January 2nd, and I view it as a day-long running battle. To me, the Battle of Assunpink Creek was the fighting withdrawal by the Americans along the Post Road or the Princeton-Trenton Road to try to slow up Cornwallis's advance from Trenton to Princeton, and then the fighting at the creek late in the day at sunset, into which that fighting retreat segued, and which was largely an exchange of cannon fire. We were talking about the role of artillery in the first battle. I think it's worth noting that artillery played a very important role in all three battles to the Americans' advantage. And that was part of Washington's plans. He deliberately wanted to go into each engagement with marked superiority in artillery, and he did so. And it made a difference, I think. So, the Battle of Assunpink Creek, I think, was largely ignored by historians for generations, and still is to a certain extent today, I think. I believe David Hackett Fisher was really the first one to give it its due. And so I think it's so crucial because had the British succeeded in getting to Trenton earlier than they did, which was Cornwallis's objective, to get there by mid-afternoon, he's a good enough general that he was able to spot the means of outflanking Washington's army at one of the upper fords, Phillips Ford, which was apparently passable that day. And, had he been able to do so, his army could, at least in theory, have outflanked the Americans on their right and driven them up against the Delaware riverbank. Henry Knox alludes to this pretty explicitly, I think, in his correspondence with his wife, Lucy, a few days later. Had that occurred, I believe it would have meant effectively the end of Washington's army. I don't know whether it would have meant the end of the Revolution, but I think it would have effectively ended his army and would have effectively ended Washington. I think he most likely would have died on the battlefield, or if he didn't, he would have had a close encounter of the worst kind with a British rope. But had things played out that way, Trenton won would have been a historical footnote. It would have had no strategic significance. There would have been no Battle of Princeton the next day. So I believe that makes Assunpink not only the most pivotal moment of the 10 Crucial Days, but I think you can make a case it was the most pivotal moment of the Revolutionary War. And there are various aspects to that battle that distinguish it from the other two battles, Trenton One and Princeton, such as the fact that it was the only time during that period that they were fighting both a combined British and Hessian army, a larger army that was under a British general, Cornwallis, who was arguably the most proficient battlefield commander the British had, certainly the most aggressive. And it was the only one where Washington's army was fighting with, essentially between two waterways. They had the creek in front of them, they had the river behind them. They had no significant number of boats to affect a nautical evacuation. So they were really had their backs to the wall, or the river, as the case may be. And of course, that led to the remarkable story of their great escape to Princeton, which I think he had in mind all along. I don't think that was something that just sprang, came forth suddenly from the meeting he had, the Council of War he had with his generals after the fighting in Assunpink Creek. I think that the events of January 2nd were absolutely critical. It was truly an existential. I don't think it's hyperbole to say it was an existential moment for Washington's army.
Yeah, I think when you look at the decisions Washington had to make in that time period, really do seem like crucial. And of course, as you mentioned, the events there then are going to lead to the next day, the Battle of Princeton. And you can see that in the painting behind Roger there. And I think the Battle of Princeton is also extremely critical. And often, I think both, Roger mentioned that these are two different campaigns, the first campaign and then the second campaign. The second campaign, I think, does often get short shrift compared to the other one. But I think Princeton is going to play a pivotal role, not only in the actual military campaign, but also I think in the career of George Washington and basically his role in the Revolution. I think his personal bravery on the battlefield there played a big role in his men sticking by him through some of what would be the even further difficult times that the Continental Army is going to go through, for sure.
Mark, if I could just punctuate something here, what I'd like to be able to do is to show you just a couple of maps here, so that people can get an idea of the significance of the 10 Crucial Days. Essentially, before the 10 Crucial Days, what we were looking at is a occupied Jersey. I mean, here's the map of New Jersey, and you've got all of these towns essentially is what you had in Jersey. And before the 10 Crucial Days, all of the jerseys were occupied. After the 10 Crucial Days, the British were pushed back to Staten Island, Manhattan, and Long Island, and along the Raritan to Brunswick. But the rest of this whole area were retaken by Washington and the troops. So essentially, that's the significance of the 10 Crucial Days. Before the 10 Crucial Days, you had an entire colony was occupied, and after the 10 Crucial Days, the jerseys were never occupied again throughout the entire war. So that's what's critical to understand about the two campaigns.
Yeah, no, I think one of my favorite quotes is from a British historian. He said, "Never in the history of the world had so few men in such a short amount of time had larger impacts on the history of the world." And I think a lot of the significance of the 10 Crucial Days comes from just really how dire a situation Washington and the Continental Army were in just before Washington crossed the Delaware in the first campaign. So I think when it comes to a place of or a subject to study or to learn more about, I think this makes a good argument for why these battles are really significant to understand in a much deeper way, for sure. But yeah, we're getting close to the end here. Does Larry or David have any final thoughts on the significance of the 10 Crucial Days campaign?
Well, I'd say it also probably changed the whole public image of Washington, certainly for many people. Prior to this, he was, I think, a growing number of people, including some of his own officers and some members of the Congress, were suggesting that he was a pretty inept, indecisive leader, because he had been. But then, all of a sudden now he's a military genius and a national hero.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that it's also important to note that it wasn't just the Continental Army that was in bad shape before the 10 Crucial Days. It was really the whole revolution. And particularly in New Jersey, being occupied, as Roger pointed out, loyalists in New Jersey felt empowered. They had been run roughshod by the Patriots after the Declaration of Independence and a new state government and all of that. Now the loyalists feel they can take it back again and get revenge for the treatment that they'd received. On the other hand, the Patriots, who had felt that they were in charge, also felt that they'd been abandoned by the Continental Congress as well as the Continental Army. And, with the British occupation, there was no real hope for them. The brand new New Jersey government, less than 6 months old, virtually disintegrated in December. Nobody knew where the governor was. And the legislators had either gone to safer parts of the state or out of the state entirely, so that it was just not a functioning government anymore. And by the end of the 10 Crucial Days, New Jersey was able to get back together again under a patriot government. And now it's the loyalists who feel abandoned by the British and the patriots who feel supported again. So, and again, 6.5 more years of war before the thing is over, rather than ending right around January of 1777.
And Mark, you mentioned the quote by George Otto Trevelyan. Another Englishman, George Germain, perhaps said it even more succinctly, and although not quite as eloquently, in his comments to Parliament 2.5 years later. And I quote, "All our hopes were blasted by that unhappy affair at Trenton."
Yep, which you can see there on that's immortalized on the Trenton Battle Monument down there, downtown Trenton. So, But I think Roger had one more thing he wanted to share with us.
Yeah, I just wanted to, we, at our website, 10crucialdays.org, we have this recommended book list. So you can go to 10crucialdays.org and there's a tab up there that just says about and then read, and you'll see these are all of the books that you're to learn more about the 10 crucial days. I have them separated here, books specifically about the 10 crucial days and some supplementary books, and then a few more. And here's books for young readers, which is also terrific. So, and you can get these books anywhere. I have little buy buttons here. You can get them here. You can get them at the gift shops at the old barracks or at Washington Crossing or anywhere that books are sold. I mean, you know, you can get them online, and there's Mark's book, there's Larry and David's books. And I also just wanted to let everybody know that Patrick K. O'Donnell is coming out with a book this year on the 14th Massachusetts, the Marblehead, Glover's Marbleheaders, which I've just read. I read it on Christmas Day. It's really terrific, fantastic book. And that's coming out in May. So.
Excellent. Yeah, no, I think there's obviously, you know, we could, like we mentioned, we could go on for hours about all this campaign. There's plenty to research and study. So we definitely recommend everybody, yeah, go to 10crucialdays.org, check out their book list. There's a lot of good resources on there. But yeah, no, we just really want to thank all three of you for coming on here with the Emerging Revolutionary War. And yeah, hopefully once COVID's over, people are able to travel again and be able to go visit some of these sites, go to Washington's Crossing. We're trying to do a tour as well of Trenton and Princeton next November, and just try to get people to get to the sites, learn about the history, learn about the importance of these events that happened. But thank you all for tuning in tonight. And we will see you all in, I think, 2 more weeks will be our next discussion we'll do here on Emerging Revolutionary War. But thank you, gentlemen, for joining us tonight.
Thank you.